Sentinels were placed at the approaches of the farm. In addition, 4 pigeons were sent to Foxwood with conciliatory messages which it hoped might re-establish good relations with Pinkerton. The very next morning the attack came. The animals were at breakfast when the lookouts came racing in with news that Frederick and his followers had already come through the 5-barreled gates. Boldly enough, the animals sallied forth to meet them, but this time they did not have the easy victory that had been in the Battle of Cowshed. There were 15 men, with half a dozen guns between them, and they opened fire as soon as they got within 50 yards. The animals could not face the terrible explosions and stinging pellets, and in spite of the efforts of Napoleon and Boxer to rally them, they were soon driven back. A number of them were already wounded. They took refuge in the farm building and peeped cautiously from chinks and knotholes. The whole of the big pasture, including the windmill, was in the hands of the enemy. For the moment, even Napoleon seemed at a loss. He paced up and down without a word, his tail rigid and twitching. Wistful glances were sent in the direction of Foxwood. If Pinkerton and his men would help them, that the day might yet be won. But at the moment, the 4 pigeons who had been sent out that day before returned, one of them bearing a scrap of paper from Pinkerton. On the penciled the words, "Serves you right." Meanwhile, Frederick and his men had halted about the windmill. The animals watched them, and a murmur of dismay went round. 2 of them produced a crowbar and a sledgehammer. They were going to knock the windmill down. "Impossible!" cried Napoleon. "We have built the walls far too thick for that. They could not knock it down in a week. Courage, comrades!" But Benjamin was watching the movements of the men intently. 2 with a hammer and the crowbar were drilling a hole near the base of the windmill. Slowly, with an air almost of amusement, Benjamin nodded his long muzzle. "I thought so," he said. "Do you not see what they're doing? In another moment they're going to pack blasting powder into that hole." Terrified, the animals waited. It was impossible now to venture out to the shelter of the buildings. After a few minutes the men were seen to be running in all directions. Then there was a deafening roar. The pigeons swirled in the air, and the animals, except for Napoleon, flung themselves flat on their bellies and hid their faces. When they got up again, a huge cloud of black smoke was hanging where the windmill had been. Slowly the breeze drifted away. The windmill ceased to exist. At the sight, the animals' courage returned to them. The fear and despair that they had felt a moment earlier were drowned by their rage against this vile, contemptible act. A mighty cry for vengeance went up. Without waiting for further orders, they charged forth in the body and made straight for their enemy. This time they did not heed the cruel pellets that swept over them like hail. It was a savage, bitter battle. The men fired again and again, and when the animals got close quarters, lashed out with their sticks and heavy boots. A cow, 3 sheep, 2 geese were killed, and nearly everyone was wounded. Even Napoleon, who was directing operations from the rear, had the tip of his tail clipped by a pellet. But the men did not go unscathed either. 3 of them had their heads broken by blows from Boxer's hoofs. Another was gored in his belly by the cow horn. Another had his trousers nearly torn off by Jessie and Bluebell. And with the 9 dogs of Napoleon's own bodyguard, whom had instructed to make detour under cover of the hedge, suddenly appeared in the men's flank, baying ferociously. Panic overtook them. They saw they were in danger of being surrounded. Frederick shouted to the men to get out while the getting was good, and the next moment the cowardly enemy was running for dear life. The animals chased them right down to the bottom of the field, and got some last kicks at them and forced their way through the thorn hedge. They had won, but they were weary and bleeding. Slowly they began to limp back towards the farm. The sight of their dead comrades stretched upon the grass moved some of them to tears, and for a little while they halted in sorrowful silence at the place where the windmill had once stood. Yes, it was gone. Almost the last traces of the labor was gone. Even the foundations were partially destroyed. And in rebuilding it, they could not, this time as before, make use of the fallen stones. This time the stones vanished too. The force of the explosion had flung them into a distance of hundreds of yards. It was as though the windmill had never been. As they approached the farm, Squealer, who had unaccountably been absent during the fighting, came skipping towards them, whisking his tail and beaming with satisfaction. As the animals heard, from the direction of the farm building, the solemn booming of a gun. "What is that gunfire for?" said Boxer. "To celebrate our victory," cried Squealer. "What victory?" said Boxer. His knees were bleeding. He had lost a shoe and split his hoof, and a dozen pellets had lodged themselves into his hind leg. "What victory, comrade?" "We have not driven off the enemy off our soil, the sacred soil of Animal Farm, but they destroyed the windmill, and we have worked on it for 2 years. What matter? We'll build another windmill. We will build 6 windmills if we feel like it. You do not appreciate, comrade, the mighty thing that we have done. The enemy was in occupation of this very ground that we stand upon, and now, thanks to the leadership of Comrade Napoleon, we have won every inch of it back again. Then we have won back what we had before," said Boxer. "That is our victory," said Squealer. They limped into the yard. The pellets under the skin of Boxer's legs smarted painfully. He saw ahead of them heavy labor of rebuilding the windmill from the foundation, and already in imagination he braced himself for the task. But for the first time it occurred to him that he was 11 years old, and perhaps his great muscles were not quite what they had once been. But when the animals saw the green flag flying, and heard the gun firing, 7 times it was fired in all, and heard the speech that Napoleon made congratulating them on their conduct, it did seem to them, after all, that they had won a great victory. The animals slain in the battle were given a solemn funeral. Boxer and Clover pulled the wagon which served as a hearse, and Napoleon himself walked at the head of the procession. 2 whole days were given over to celebrations. There were songs, speeches, more firing of the gun, and a special gift of an apple was bestowed on every animal, with 2 ounces of corn for each bird, and 3 biscuits for each dog. It was announced that the battle would be called the Battle of the Windmill, and that Napoleon had created a new decoration of the Order of the Green Banner, which he had conferred upon himself. The general rejoicing and unfortunate affair of banknotes were all forgotten. A few days later, that the pigs came upon a case of whiskey in the cellar of the farmhouse. It had been overlooked at the time when the house was first occupied. That night there came from the farmhouse a sound of loud singing, in which, to everyone's surprise, the strains of Beasts of England were mixed up. At about 9:30, Napoleon, wearing an old bowler hat of Mrs. Jones, was distinctly seen to emerge from the back door, gallop rapidly around the yard, and disappear indoors again. But in the morning a deep silence hung on the farmhouse. Not a pig appeared to be stirring. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Squealer made his appearance, walking slowly and dejectedly, his eyes dull, his tail hanging limply behind him, and with every appearance of being seriously ill. He called the animals together and told them that a terrible piece of news was to impart. Comrade Napoleon was dying. The cry of lamentation went out. Straw was laid down outside the doors of the farmhouse, and the animals walked on tiptoe. With tears in their eyes, they asked one another what they should do if their leader were taken away from them. A rumor went round that Snowball had, after all, contrived to induce poison into Napoleon's food. At 11 o'clock, Squealer came out to make another announcement. As his last act upon earth, Comrade Napoleon had announced a solemn decree. The drinking of alcohol was to be punished by death. By that evening, however, Napoleon appeared to be somewhat better, and the following morning Squealer was able to tell them that he was well on his way to recovery. By the evening of that day, Napoleon was back at work, and the next day it was learned that he had instructed Whymper to purchase at Wellington some booklets on brewing and distilling. A week later, Napoleon gave orders that a small paddock behind the orchard, which had previously been intended to set aside as grazing ground for animals who were past work, was to be plowed up. It was given out that the pasture be exhausted and needed reseeding, but it soon became known Napoleon intended to sow it with barley. About this time occurred a strange incident, which hardly anyone was able to understand. One night, at about 12 o'clock, there was a loud crash in the yard. The animals rushed out of their stalls. It was a moonlit night. At the foot of the end of the big barn, where the 7 commandments were written, there lay a ladder broken in 2 pieces. Squealer, temporarily stunned, was sprawled beside it, and near the hand lay a lantern, a paintbrush, and an overturned pot of white paint. The dogs immediately made a ring around Squealer and escorted him back to the farmhouse as soon as he was able to walk. None of the animals could form any idea as what this meant, except old Benjamin, who nodded his muzzle with a knowing air, and seemed to understand, but would say nothing. But a few days later, Muriel, reading over the 7 Commandments to herself, noticed that there had yet another one of them that the animals had remembered wrong. They had thought that the 5th commandment was, "No animal shall drink alcohol," but there was 2 words that had forgotten. Actually, the commandment read, "No animal shall drink alcohol to excess."